What's up guys, it's Topsy and welcome back to the channel. So a few weeks back, I ended up making a complete guide onto how to play all the decks from Battle City Finals. And I saw that a lot of people really appreciated that I took the time to break down all the character decks alongside all the nuances behind each of those decks. And a few days back, I actually ended up making a poll on both the Speed Duel Reddit and on my YouTube channel to see what the next box you guys wanted to see me break down. And by a narrow margin, Streets of Battle City ended up winning. So this is going to be part 1 of breaking down all the character decks from Streets of Battle City. So a quick rundown as to what exactly we're going to be doing in today's video. Essentially what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be going ahead and taking a look at each of the individual character decks and breaking down what the initial strategy of the deck is, what the point of the skill is trying to do, alongside breaking down the purpose of each individual card in that character's deck. And then finally we're going to wrap up with a few test hands to get a rough idea of as to how exactly you would play a turn 1 with each of these character decks with a randomized hand. Alright, with all that being said, if you guys do end up enjoying today's video and would like to support the channel, then I would really appreciate if you could leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you have any friends that you would like to get into speed duels, then feel free to share this video so they can learn how to pilot each of these character decks. With all that being said, let's dive right in. Alright then, so here we have Yugi's deck, and honestly, I remember when Streets of Battle City had come out, I was really harsh on Yugi's strategy, just because I thought it was fairly bland and boring, but after a lot of time with it, I found myself really appreciating this deck, and I just think it's a really fun strategy. So let's go ahead and break it down as to what exactly this deck is trying to accomplish. The first thing you should understand is that this deck is split into two different strategies. We have the Dark Paladin Turbo, let's put that with air quotes, deck, and we also have the counter deck that deals a lot with spell counters. The main skill here for the deck is the spell counter strategy, which in my opinion is the funner version of the two decks, while the secondary deck is the secondary skill deals with Buster Blader. For this deck in particular, we're only going to be focusing in on the spell counter strategy just because the second skill isn't that interesting for the most part, and the deck is so marginally around that I feel like focusing in on the spell counter strategy is a lot more fruitful. Alright, so the main skill for the deck is Ultimate Wizardry, and it's a great skill. So it reads, when you activate this skill, place up to 1 spell counter on each face-up spellcaster monster you control that can be placed a spell counter on. Once per turn during your main phase, you can place 1 spell counter on a face-up spellcaster monster you control that you can place a spell counter on. So as a whole, this skill is unbelievably incredible. I absolutely love the way it's designed, and it makes for a really good skill for this dedicated strategy. The main thing you should know regarding this skill is honestly one main thing. That is the effect to put a spell counter on each spellcaster monster you control, and the effect to place a spell counter on each individual spellcaster monster you control are separate skills. The first only activates upon flipping the skill over, and it can only be activated at that time. That means that you can't go ahead and use that effect multiple times during a duel. But the other effect, the once per turn one, well, obviously enough, that is a once per turn. Another cool thing you should know is that these two effects in particular can be stacked on the same turn. So when you flip this card over, you can place a spell counter on a monster, and then in addition, you can activate the skill, the once per turn one, to place the same spell counter on another monster. So that's a cool little interaction you should know about. There is one more interaction that I want to focus in, but we'll focus in on that interaction once we do our test hands. But besides that, that's all you really need to know regarding Ultimate Wizardry. Great skill. Oh, I guess a quick note regarding the Dragon Hunting Swordsman. This skill is just your overall generic fusion skill that allows you to summon into a monster that requires Buster Blader as a fusion material. The only monster that in the game that does that is Dark Paladin, and in addition it also has a neat little effect where while you control Buster Blader or Dark Paladin on the field, you can make all your opponent's monsters on the graveyard become dragon, which I guess is just supposed to help the game get bigger. Overall, interesting skill, not crazy good or anything to write home about, but this one is pretty great. Alright then, so let's go and begin with the deck in itself. So the first few cards we're going to see is Dark Magician, Dark Buster Blader, Destruction Swordsman Fusion, alongside Miracle Restoring. Overall, these cards are mainly focused in on the Dark Paladin strategy, and that is their main purpose. Of course, we have the fusion materials, we have the fusion spell, and we have Miracle Restoring, which is a card that kind of links the deck with the spell counter strategy for the very fact that you are able to remove spell counters to revive a Buster Blader and or Dark Magician later in the duel from the graveyard, which is pretty great. Speaking of cards that connect the two strategies together, we have Skilled Dark Magician and Skilled White Magician. These cards are again cards that deal with spell counters, but the cool thing about them is the fact that upon accumulating 3 spell counters, each of these cards are able to special summon their dedicated monster in Dark Magician and or Buster Blader, which is super useful, especially especially if you have those cards in the graveyard in their deck. So these are decent cards in the strategy. Moving on, we have Breaker the Magical Warrior, which is the absolute MVP of the deck. This card is incredible for the very fact that it is a back row nuke in this deck, and it feels almost borderline unfair in this deck. One thing you should know about the Breaker the Magical Warrior though is that the effect to pop a back row is not once per turn, so you are able to abuse the absolute crap out of that effect, so keep that in mind, it's very important. Alright, next card up is, actually let's move him right here, we'll talk about him in a second. Is Blast Magician, which Blast Magician is an interesting card. It is kind of like budget breaker but for monsters, and the reason I say that is that this card, it has a more convoluted way of dealing with your opponent's monsters. Breaker just needs to remove a spell counter to pop a back row, while this card you need to jump through a few more steps in order to pop up monsters, because it can destroy an opponent's monster up to the number of spell counters it has. But the thing is that those spell counters have to become equivalent and or greater to that opponent's monster's attack, because it judges it based on spell counter times 700 attack points, which is a weird way of like saying that if your opponent has a monster with, let's say, 2000 attack points, you would have to remove 3 counters from this card in order to pop that monster. Weird card, but it is decent, especially because you're able to accumulate quite a few spell counters with this deck. Moving on, we have Alchemist of Black Spells. This card isn't able to accumulate any spell counters, but it is once per turn able to distribute spell counters to monsters that are able to hold them. As a whole, this card isn't phenomenal. You don't ever want to really open with this card, but it has a nice defense stat, so it's there for that reason. After that, we have a small little engine in the deck with Apprentice Skill Magician, Moth, and Oath Vindictive Magician. And the reason to call this a small little engine is because of the fact that Apprentice has a multitude of different reasons to be playing this deck. First, upon hitting the field, it's able to distribute a spell counter on a monster that's able to hold them. So it's a pretty great normal summon for that. The only problem with it is the fact that it is so weak. But the other reason I say that is because this card, upon being destroyed, it is able to special summon a level 2 or lower spellcaster from the deck in face down defense position, which is where Moth and Oath Vindictive Magician comes into play. These are both flip monsters that are great. Moth able to revive a spell card from the graveyard, and Oath Vindictive being able to pop a monster. So 2 incredible cards. Typically you're not going to be normal summoning Apprentice, but if you are brave, you can do so. After that, we have some more spell counter cards with Spell Power Grasp. This card is pretty phenomenal for the very fact that upon activation, it places a spell counter on a card on the field, and typically most of the time you're going to be activating this on Breaker if possible, if you don't want to activate your skill on him, and or like Blast Magician. And the other great thing about this card is the fact that upon activation, you're able to add another copy of it from your deck to pretty much guarantee that you're always going to have access to a card for spell counters. After that, we have Pitch Black Power Stone, which is a pretty interesting trap card for the very fact that upon activation, it's able to store 3 spell counters on it, and then once per turn, you're able to distribute those on a monster on the field. Again, another way to typically power up either Breaker and or the Blast Magician. Finally, we have just generic cards with Ready for Interception. Typically, you can use this card. It's in very rare circumstances against your opponent, but typically you're going to be using it defensively with cards like Blast Magician and or Alchemist of Black Spells, or even like Apprentice Magician if you don't want to take the direct damage, because what this card does is switches a spellcaster or warrior monster on the field into defense position. After that, we have Dark Magician Girl. This card has almost no use in the deck besides being tied to Dark Magician. Melody Dispersion, just a very bad form of backward removal. Mage Power is actually really great in this deck, and especially if you pair it up with Breaker, it becomes essentially the boss monster of the deck. Finally, we have Solitary Sword of Poison, which is another great card if you are just sticking with one monster on the field. But yeah, that's pretty much the deck. Overall, pretty fun. It's pretty great and pretty concise, and I definitely recommend you play it if you get the chance. Now it's time for some test hands. Alright then guys, so here we have a average hand for Yugi spell counter strategy. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by putting the Dark Magician at the top of the deck. And let's imagine this is your opening hand. So if this is your opening hand, you are going to be playing the Ultimate Wizardry skill. And with that, turn 1, what I would probably do here is that I would begin by setting my Apprentice Magician face down. After that, I would hold on to the Spell Power Grasp, just because you want to go ahead and save these cards for later on in the duel when you're able to have monsters that can hold spell counters on them. Essentially, what this turn does is that once you end your turn, your opponent goes and begins their turn. Let's say your opponent summons a monster, they go ahead and declare an attack with this card. Alright, they declare an attack with the Buster Blader, they destroy your Apprentice Magician, it goes to the graveyard. You then activate the effect of your Apprentice Magician. This would then go ahead and allow you to special summon either a copy of your Magician of Faith and or your old Vindictive Magician. In this scenario, I would go ahead and say that you want to go ahead and summon the Vindictive Magician, just for the very fact that when this card is set to your side of the field, because keep in mind, it does set it, once it's your turn once again, you get to draw for a turn, and look at that. You have so many more plays available to you. First, you are able to flip summon the old Vindictive Magician, which allows you to pop the monster your opponent had on their field, so you get to send it to the graveyard. And additionally, if they decided to set any back row, you could go ahead and normal summon your Breaker the Magical Warrior in this scenario right here. Go ahead and activate the effect of Breaker, go ahead and destroy one of the back rows, activate the effect of Ultimate Wizardry, give Breaker again another counter, and depending on how much back row you want they have on their field, you can pop up to 3 cards in their back row with the activation of Breaker alone. And even if you went ahead and went through all your pops with Breaker, you could then activate the effect of Spell Power Grasp, giving him another spell counter, and pretty much ensuring that he still has that 1900 attack stat line. And that is huge. Additionally, if your opponent didn't have any back row in this scenario, then I would say that what you could do here is that you could go ahead and return this to your hand, and then go ahead and normal summon something like the Skilled White Magician. With the summon of Skilled White Magician, you could go ahead and activate the effect of Spell Power Grasp. This would then give your Skilled White Magician a spell counter on it, but then his effect would activate and give him another one. Then you could activate the effect of Ultimate Wizardry, giving it one more counter, and with that, you can go ahead and summon Buster Blader, which is pretty great. But yeah, as I said, with that hand alone, you could do quite a bit. Let's go ahead and try another one. Alright, this hand isn't too bad. So what I would do here, let's go ahead and put this at the top of the deck. I would probably begin by setting the Alchemist of Black Spells, just because realistically you don't have any other real play here. You would hold on to your Spell Power Grasp and your Malice of Dispersion. As I mentioned, these cards are not great in the deck. They kind of just feel like bricks at all times, and you kind of just want to hold on to your Alchemist until you're able to do anything. If your opponent attacks into it and they had greater attack, of course you would be out of a monster, but on the crackback, at least you do get to draw into your Skilled White Magician. And as we did in the first test hand, you could go ahead and pretty much establish a Buster Blader immediately, which would be really great. But yeah, that's pretty much the Yugi spell counter strategy. As I mentioned, primarily you want to see a lot of these spell counter monsters. And that skill, the main skill of the deck, is phenomenal for that. It is such a godsend for the deck, especially when you see plenty of these cards. Also, I've been getting this asked quite often in my videos, but if you're interested, what I'm using to do all these test hands, it's called Dueling Book. I'll have a link in the description below if you want to go ahead and check it out. It's just a website. It's completely free. All you have to do is just make like a login account, and that's it. And but yeah, it's pretty great, especially when you want to simulate duels. Okay, let's move on to the next character now. Alright guys, next up we have Joey. And Joey is one of those interesting characters where technically he has a strategy with his skills, but for the most part he just kind of has warrior good stuff. We saw this also in Streets of Battle City Finals, and same applies to Streets of Battle City. But the one thing I will mention about Joey's deck is the fact that both his skills are actually warranted to be spoken about in this deck, because it changes the deck dramatically. So let's go ahead and have a quick conversation about that. So the main skill for the deck is Iron Grit, which is essentially just a dedicated Gilfrey the Iron Knight strategy that makes him unaffected by your opponent's cards. And this is pretty great just because of the fact that Gilfrey is already a decently statted monster, and if you pair him up with cards like Blast with Chain, he can become a real threat to your opponent, because they're not able to interact with it whatsoever. So any back row stuff they have is just, it's moot against Gilfrey, which makes it a pretty good skill, and especially for the fact that the deck runs 2 copies of it already. So a decent skill overall. However, the skill that I kind of wanted to focus in on more is Heart of the Warrior, which is a pretty great skill. And if you remember guys, this card saw a ton of competitive play in speed duels, for the very fact that what this skill does is that every single turn you're able to special summon a monster from your extra deck as long as it is a vanilla warrior, and that's pretty much it. Upon discarding, you're able to summon one of these cards, and in this deck your targets are Carbomino Warrior, Gyota the Dragon Knight, and finally Flame Swordsman. The greatest thing about this skill is the fact that upon turn 1 you are able to establish a pretty decent monster and equip it with something like Lightning Blade or United We Stand for a lot of like firepower turn 1. But yeah, as I mentioned, 2 super generic skills that there isn't all that much to talk about. Now it's time to talk about the deck in itself. So beginning with the most underwhelming stuff, with Baby Dragon, Alligator Swords, Time Wizard, and Polly. The only reason these cards are in here are because it's Joey and these are all kind of cards to him, but for 2, Alligator Swords Dragon and Thousand Dragon are 2 cards in the extra deck for some reason. And you need a way to make them, so that's the main reason they're here. So we don't really have to focus on these cards. They are typically going to be the cards you are going to discard for the effect of Heart of Warriors, if we're being honest. After that, we have the Gale-free engine, which is double Gale-free with the Blast with Chain. Blast with Chain, if you are unfamiliar with this card, is a phenomenal trap card, especially when you pair it up with any Gale-free monster. For the very fact that upon it being destroyed by card effect, which Gale-free already does by default, it is able to pop a card on the field, which is an insane effect. So if you're able to do this at a pinnacle point in the duel, it could just win you the duel. So an incredible card. And then after that, we are just dealing with generic good stuff. Marauding Captain for storming the field, Rocket Warrior, it can come up, but for the most part, it typically doesn't do all that much, just for the very fact that upon attacking a monster, it is able to reduce that monster by 500 attack points. So under certain circumstances, you can attack with a Rocket Warrior and then deal with it with a Gale-free. But again, it is such a niche effect that it typically won't come up. Little Wing Guard doesn't really do much. Next up, we have Command Knight, which is a pretty decent card, but it doesn't really help with the Gale-free in particular, because Gale-free is unaffected by card effects, and well, this is the effect of Command Knight, so it wouldn't be powering it up. And finally, we have Freed, and Freed is just a yes here to search out Gale-free. Now for the spell and trap cards. We have Lightning Blade, Rhoda, United We Stand. These cards are just oriented for your warriors, either powering them up and or searching them out, so not much to say there. We have Kunai with Chain. It is a defensive card, but also it can help you power up your monster, so it's pretty cool in the way that it works. And the last cards we have here are all dice related, because it's Joey, of course. Skull Dice and Graceful Dice, I'm sure we don't have to go in depth into these cards. Roulette Spider is more of a gimmick card, cute card I suppose. And finally we have Dice Spoon as the dedicated form of back removal of the deck. But yeah, that's Joey's deck. As I mentioned, not a crazy amount to talk about just because of the fact that Joey's decks are never that complex. But now it's time to get into some test hands for Joey. Alrighty then, so here we have an average hand for Joey. Let's go ahead and put up the skill. As I mentioned, Joey doesn't have a ton going on for him just because of the fact the deck is super simplistic. As you can see in our opening hand, we already have Gale-free the Iron Knight. I probably would just go ahead and begin with this turn by summoning out Gale-free, just because you never know what your opponent may have, how they could counter it. As an example, like if your opponent was playing something like Zane with Cyber Dragon, summoning out Gale-free could be really bad for you because they could add it immediately, and it's kind of like the linchpin of the deck. So instead, what I would do is that I would begin the turn by summoning out Little Wing Guard in defense mode, and pretty much ensuring that whatever they summon has a harder time outing it. And if they did summon something that can out it, then that just kind of goes ahead and shows that Gale-free would have been outed as well. If you really wanted to, you could also go ahead and set the Roulette Spider. Again, it's a very gimmicky card, but I mean, if you have it in your hand, you might as well use it. However, if instead you were playing the Field of Warriors deck instead, so if you were using this skill instead, what I would do here is that I would personally go ahead and begin by going ahead and discarding one of these cards. Again, it is completely up to you. Time Wizard and Roulette Spider are both great choices to go ahead and discard, but I think in this scenario, I would go ahead and discard our Time Wizard and then just begin by special summoning out your Guilty the Dragon Knight. And with that, turn 1, you could pass on this. Alright, let's go ahead and try another test hand. Alright, oh man, that would have been so nice in the opening hand. So let's go ahead and say this is our standard hand for Joey. Go ahead and begin with this skill. Put this at the top of the deck. And here you can do quite a bit. Realistically, I can see myself going ahead and summoning out probably Little Wing Guard again, if I'm being real here, just to go ahead and scope out what our opponent may be doing. Rocket Warrior is an interesting choice as well, just because pairing this card up with any monster pretty much ensures that you have an easier time outing any card your opponent may have, because you can reduce the attack of that monster by 500. And you know what, we actually do have pretty safe plays, so let's go ahead and do that. Actually, we'll go ahead and summon out Rocket Warrior. We'll go ahead and set a copy of Kunai with Chain to pretty much ensure that Rocket Warrior survives that turn. And then here, if our opponent go ahead and starts their turn, they would summon a monster. They would try and out the Rocket Warrior because it's not that big. Keep in mind the effect of Rocket Warrior only activates during your battle phase. Here, he would be able to be destroyed, but if we wanted to protect it, we could activate Kunai with Chain, go ahead and change the battle position of the opponent's monster and boost him up by 500 attack points. And with that, on the crackback, we would go ahead and draw for turn. We would get a copy of Rhoda. We would activate the Rhoda. And then we would go ahead and get to add anything we want in our deck. Realistically here, you could search out the Guilfrey to pretty much ensure that Guilfrey's able to out anything. You could go ahead and search out Command Knight if you wanted to go ahead and boost all your warriors on the field. Hell, you could even search out Marine Captain if you wanted to swarm the entire field with warrior monsters. I think in this scenario, I would probably just search out the Guilfrey. I would normal summon it and pretty much just go ahead and attack our opponent there. All right, we'll do one more hand, and we'll do that one with the Heart of Warriors deck. Alrighty, pretty decent hand, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, so let's go ahead and establish our skill. And here, oh man, this is a rough one just because I don't really want to discard anything in this particular hand. But let's go ahead and begin by activating our Rhoda. Send this to the graveyard, search out. And here what we can search out is quite a bit. We can search out Command Knight to pretty much ensure that whatever monster we summon later on during the turn from the extra deck is going to get exponentially boosted. Also, Command Knight has a really high defense stat. So you know what, the more I say that, the more I am thinking Command Knight is the play here. So we'll go ahead and add Command Knight to the hand. And I will go ahead and begin by... We'll play a little reckless here. We're going to normal summon our Marine Captain. We'll go ahead and special summon out the Command Knight, and with Command Knight on the field, both of them are going to get boosted up to 1600 attack points. Additionally, we'll go ahead and set our copy of Graceful Dice here, and hopefully with this board right here, if our opponent summons anything to their field, we should have a fairly decent time outing it. If you wanted to go ahead and make a safer play, what I would do instead is that we would go ahead and set our copy of Command Knight. We would set a Graceful Dice. We would then go ahead and activate the skill to go ahead and discard our potentially Rocket Warrior, Marine Captain, depending on what you want to do. Marine Captain is probably not a bad choice here, just because if you summon out the monster from the extra deck, your field is going to get clocked very easily. We would summon out the Guiltia with the effect of Heart of Warriors, and essentially here we have a pretty decent board where your opponent has the choice of attacking one of these two cards or play more defensively if they can't out the Guiltia. And if they decide to play more defensively on the crackback, when it's your turn once again, you'd be able to draw for turn. You would go ahead and flip summon your Command Knight and then boost up the Guiltia because it is a warrior monster, and you will have a pretty decent time going for game here. But yeah, those are just some rough ideas as to how exactly I would go ahead and pilot this deck. Alright then, so now we have Mako, and Mako was one of the characters that I was the most excited for whenever I saw Streets of Battle City, but being honest with you guys, I wasn't fully impressed with the deck he ended up getting. Nevertheless, it's still a fairly fun strategy. So Mako is one of those unique characters where I actually prefer the secondary skill over the primary skill, so we're going to go ahead and briefly mention both of them. So the primary skill for him is Well of a Tale, and essentially what this skill does is that you're either able to discard a card to search out Fortress Will and or the ritual spell. Fairly straightforward for a ritual based strategy. But the cool thing about this is that while you control Fortress Will, you do give all your face of water monsters immunity from your opponent's spell and trap cards, which is pretty great. The only reason I don't particularly like this skill is for the very fact that Fortress Will is a level 7 ritual monster, therefore summoning it is typically going to require your full hand in best case scenario in order to do so. Alright, now for the secondary skill, which I mentioned, I'm actually a bigger fan of. So what this skill reads is essentially, while Umi is face up on the field, you get some of the following effects. The effect number one is that vanilla water monsters are unaffected by your opponent's monster effects, which is pretty awesome. Another type of protection for your water monsters. But the second effect is why I like this skill so much, and it's once every turn you're able to add a water monster from your graveyard to your hand. But you can't summon monsters until you summon that card with that very dedicated name, which is a great way to recover resources from the graveyard, especially if you ritual summoned for the Fortress Well. And again, I don't know which is the better skill for this deck. I typically lean towards Bountiful Ocean just for the fact that it helps a majority of the deck, as opposed to a Well of a Tale, which can help you with consistency, but again, not the best for it as well. I figured that it was worth mentioning both of them for this particular reason. Now it's time to break down the deck in itself. So starting off, we have some interesting monsters with Air Orca and Flying Fang. These cards in particular are very unique in this deck for the very fact that, well, they have very interesting typings and attributes. Air Orca being a sea serpent wind and Flying Fang being a wind fish. For the most part, you're going to notice that these two cards in particular are going to have a hard time blending into this deck. In particular, Air Orca, just for the very fact their attribute and typing. However, Flying Fang is a pretty great card in my opinion, for the very fact that with Umi on the field, this card is an 1800 attack piercer that is extremely difficult to deal with because of the fact that it bounces itself until your next standby phase every single turn, which is a really annoying thing if you're able to establish a loop with this. Really oppressive card if you're able to actually like pull it off. The Air Orca, however, it just doesn't have the right cards in order to make it work properly. So I think it's cool, but it doesn't really help the deck all that well. After that, we have the rest of the deck with Maiden of the Aqua, we have Needle Sunfish, Oyster Meister, and Piercing Moray. These are all just generically good water monsters. Maiden of the Aqua helps you with having Umi on the field, which is great for the Bountiful Ocean. We then have Oyster Meister, which is a interesting card for the very fact that it can help you with summoning out cards like Legendary Fisherman or Legendary Fisherman number 2 because of the fact that it does allow you to special summon a token upon being destroyed, so it's not the worst effect. We have Piercing Moray, which is a pretty great card for the very fact that it can become a very deadly piercer in the deck, but for the most part, you're not probably going to be using the effect, but it can come up. We have the Legendary Fisherman's. Original for Legendary Fisherman is kind of an underwhelming card, while Legendary Fisherman number 2 is a pretty decent card. The main reason I say that is because it does have a protection effect while Umi is in the field, but additionally, if this card gets dealt with by your opponent, it is able to search you out the Fortress Well as well. So that's pretty awesome. Finally, we have some vanillas in the deck with 7-color fish, Fiend Kraken, and of course the Fortress Well. I know it's technically not a vanilla, but I mean like a non-effect monster. But yeah, these are going to be the cards that particularly benefit from the effect of the Bountiful Ocean. After that, we just have some good stuff for water. With Big Wave, Small Wave, this card is particularly being used in order to bring out the Legendary Fisherman's. Not the best card for the deck, but again, it can come up. Another reason I don't particularly like this card is because we do have Air Orca and Flying Fang, which don't work with this card because they are winds, as I mentioned. We have the Fortress Well's Oath for the Fortress Well, of course. Salvage and Surface kind of work in similar ways for the very fact that they're able to recover some of your monsters from the graveyard. Again, this is another reason why these two monsters don't work that well in this deck because they target waters here, but Surface does work with them because they do fall under the jurisdiction. These cards are a little awkward in the deck. After that, we have Umi, which thankfully enough works with these cards, giving everything on the field a 200 attack and defense boost. Water Hazard, allowing you to special summon some of your cards to kind of extend plays. Fish Step Charge is the best card in the deck, allowing you to tribute a fish in order to pop a card on the field and then draw one. Phenomenal card. I love this card. Paleozoic Eldonia is a pretty decent card for the very fact that you are able to power up a monster you control. And finally, Tornado Wall. The one great interaction I do consider with Tornado Wall is that if you have Tornado Wall, Umi, and have the cycle with Flying Fang, you essentially make it to where you're never taking any battle damage. You're able to continuously deal with your opponent's monsters and or like life poise. So, but again, it's such a niche interaction that I guess it warranted mentioning. But yeah, that's Mako's deck. Let's go ahead and do some test hands now to explain it better. Alrighty, so now we have a Mako, and let's go ahead and set out our skill. And interestingly enough, turn 1, we can establish a Fortress Well if we really wanted to. So what we're going to do here is that we can go ahead and discard our copy of Paleozoic Eldonia. So we can activate the skill. We will go ahead and send the Eldonia to the graveyard. The cool thing about that is that Eldonia does have an effect in the graveyard, so it's not a waste. And we can add our copy of Fortress Well's Oath to the hand. Now, the big issue here is that if you activate the Fortress Well Oath, you would then have to send the Legendary Fisherman alongside the Fiend Kraken to the graveyard in order to summon out the Fortress Well. Doing that isn't the worst, just because you get to establish a fairly big monster, but do keep in mind that did end up taking your entire hand in order to do, which is really rough, especially if your opponent is able to out the Fortress Well immediately. So this is part of the reason I was saying I didn't particularly love Well of a Tell, even though it is pretty cool. The one saving grace this play does have is the fact that Fortress Well is protected from targeting effects with any spell and trap cards, so at least you have that going for you. But yeah, that's what a turn 1 goes looks like for this deck, especially with Fortress Well of a Tell. This is like an ideal hand. All right, let's try another one. Okay, this hand is actually pretty decent. So in this hand, I would go ahead and put the top of the deck. Let's go ahead and play this out with Well of a Tale, actually. This is probably our best case scenario. So what I would do here is that I could go ahead and summon out my Oyster Meister in attack mode and pretty much force our opponent to go ahead and out him if they want to. Additionally, I would also set our copy of Fish Step Charge here, just in case if they're able to extend quite a bit, we are able to go ahead and have at least tribute fodder off the effect of Oyster Monster if they destroy it. You could also set a copy of Tornado Wall if you really wanted to, but because we don't have access to Umi yet, it won't do much. As I said, Mako's deck is really interesting just because, just like Joey, there isn't any optimal place to do because there is no archetype behind it, and it's just kind of like water, fish, ocean, good stuff. All right, let's move on to the next character. All right then, so now we're on to Weevil, who has a extremely powerful deck and is the only character to ever get an actual skill banned for them. So, Weevil is a really interesting character to talk about just because from the 2 skills he has available to him, as I mentioned, one of them is banned, that being the secondary skill, but nevertheless, I still do plan on talking about it at least briefly. So with that being said, let's go and take a look at the primary skill first. So the primary skill for this deck is called Insect Infestation, and essentially what this skill does is that it makes it as easy as possible to play with the parasite cards. Of course, it does pale in comparison to the secondary skill. Another amazing thing about this skill is the fact that with the aid of this skill, you can also attack with cards like Insect Queen to your opponent directly, which can pretty much get out of control very, very quickly and win you a duel. So for that very reason, Insect Infestation is not a bad card whatsoever. But just like Joey, Weevil has a very interesting deck just for the very fact that for the most part, every card in this deck works individually from itself, but for the most part, it's kind of like just making the best out of every card you have available to you, just because you don't have an archetype you're working with, more of a theme, with that being insects. As for the secondary skill, that being My Precious Queen, well, this skill is absolutely busted and is very much warranted to be banned. And the reason for that is that the great thing about this skill is that not only does it allow you to tribute summon level 7 insect monsters for 1 less tribute, which is phenomenal because Insect Queen is not worth 2 tributes, but also the fact that every single turn you're able to manifest a token. Keep in mind, either player's turn, you're able to manifest a token that essentially makes it very, very difficult for your opponent to ever deal damage to you, but better yet, the fact that if your opponent goes first and you go second with this skill, on your very first turn, you have a monster already available to you, which can be tributed for the tribute summon of a card like Insect Queen, which is incredible. And for that very reason, this skill alone is one of the most broken and unbalanced skills we've seen in Speed Duel's history. So with that being said, let's go and talk about the actual composition of the deck in itself. Alright then, so talking about the monsters. So we have Insect Queen, Insect Princess, and Metal Armored Bug as the pseudo-boss monsters of the deck, I suppose, just for the very fact that Insect Queen is made fairly easy to summon via the effects of My Precious Queen, and also the fact that a lot of the cards in this deck do help you power her up a lot. Not only that, but the Insect Infestation skill also allows cards like Insect Queen to attack directly, which is pretty great. Onto the other ones, we have Insect Princess, which arguably is the better card in this deck, especially when it gets aided with cards like Parasite and Parasite Paranoid, for the very fact that it's able to get extremely big if you keep on destroying your opponent's bug monsters. Well, not bug monsters, insect monsters, my bad. And the deck has quite a few ways of doing that, so the ability to do this is not as far-fetched as you might think. Finally, Metal Armored Bug. Something important you should know regarding this card is that unfortunately, even if you play My Precious Queen, you won't get the reduced level reduction for this card because it is a level 8. Therefore, you're not able to reduce its level when tribute summoning for it. So very important thing you should know, it only works for level 7 insect monsters, not any other level. Now onto the more important cards of the deck, those being the parasites. That being Parasite and Parasite Paranoid. Paranoid being the better card, obviously, but it is important to go ahead and take a quick note of this card, just for the very fact that we have an entire skill revolved around it. Now, the reason I say Parasite is that important is just for the very fact that not only does this card inflict burn damage to your opponent whenever they end up drawing into it, but the fact that the skill allows you to pretty much stack this card, essentially guaranteeing the effect of it to come up. And another fantastic thing about this is the fact that this card allows you to transform everything on the field into insect monsters for your opponent's side of the field, which is really important, especially when you pair it up with cards like Insect Princess and skills like Insect Infestation. so really important card. The reason I say Parasite Paranoid is so much better is for the very fact that this card is a hand trap that is able to do this as well, which is incredibly powerful and very useful. Also, the fact that this card pretty much nullifies a problematic monster your opponent may have, essentially preventing them from ever attacking any of your insects, is extremely useful. And finally, the other reason why I like this card so much is the fact that whenever you deal with that opponent's monster that is equipped with Parasite Paranoid, you're allowed to cheat out any of your large insect monsters from your hand. So this card does it all, so it's one of the most important cards you're going to have available to you in any hand, and if you open this card, you are in a good position. Moving on to the utility monsters, we have Chainsaw Insect. It's just huge, but I would use this card sparingly just for the very fact that every time it attacks, it just has to attack in order to get the effect for your opponent to draw one card, so do keep that in mind. It is a huge monster, but you are benefiting your opponent whenever you attack with it. Really important thing to keep in mind regarding this card. After this, we have three extremely powerful utility cards that have their own unique utilization. We have Howling Insect, which allows you to special summon a low statted 1500 or less insect monster from your deck. We have Resonance Insect, which is able to add you a level 5 or lower insect monster from your deck to your hand. And finally, we have Pinch Hopper, which allows you to special summon one insect monster from your hand. And the fantastic thing about these cards is the fact that you can go in a loop where you can go Howling Insect into Resonance Insect and search out Pinch Hopper, or you can just skip that and do a Howling Insect into Pinch Hopper to special summon one of your large insect monsters from your hand. These cards are extremely powerful and you always want to see them in an opening hand if possible. After this, we have some of the more lackluster monsters in the deck with Gokibor. It's just a vanilla. We have Prickle Fairy. The best thing about this card is just it has a large defense stat. And finally, we have Magnetic Mosquito, which is just a dogshit card, if we're being honest. The best utility this card has is the fact that with DNA Surgery, if you really wanted to, you could transform everything on their field to machines, but that kind of feels like a waste unless you have, like, game the next turn, and you just need to resolve the effect of Magnetic Mosquito, which I guess is okay. Alright, wrapping up with the spell cards, we have Multiplication of Ants. Honestly, this is kind of just like a worse version of, well, not even kind, it is a significantly worse version of My Precious Queen. Insect Barrier, it's meant to be played with the DNA Surgery. Verdant Sanctuary, an incredible card for your deck because it gives you so much consistency. However, there is a little bit of a downside with this card because if you get into a grindy match, you are able to deck out because of how much the deck is able to search and thin out through the strategy. And finally, we have the Eradicating Aerosol, which again is meant to pair up with the DNA Surgery and or other cards like the Parasite Paranoid and or Parasite, essentially working as a dark hole, and it's really good. Continuing on, we have Spider Eggs, which is a situationally better version of Multiplication of Ants. DNA Searcher, we keep on mentioning this card already. Dust Tornado for your dedicated back removal, and finally Widespread Ruin to get rid of any problematic monster your opponent may have on their field. So overall, the deck is pretty phenomenal. There's only a few cards that kind of just don't have a purpose in the deck, but besides that, you can ignore most of it. But yeah, as I mentioned, for the most part, there isn't any crazy plays you should know regarding this deck. It's just a bunch of good stuff meshed together with a really broken skill and a other skill that is pretty decent. Alright, now let's get into some test hands. Alright then, so here we have Weevil's deck, and holy shit, this hand is kind of dog shit. So let's go ahead and begin with the main skill first. And realistically, with this hand, you can't do all that much. Best play you have here is set Gokibor, set Dust Tornado, and pray, I guess. Or set Magnetic Mosquito if you already know that the matchup is not favorable for you and this card is just dead. But yeah, realistically, not much going on here. Let's go ahead and try another hand. We'll still stick with Insect Infestation though. Man, this card right here would have fixed the hand so much. Let's go ahead and put this at the top of the deck and go ahead and let's see, what do we do here? So what I'm thinking here is that I'm gonna go ahead and set a copy of Prickle Fairy. I'll set a copy of Dust Tornado as well. And with this skill face up, we kind of just chill. Having a 2k defender is not bad at all. And we'll keep the Verdant Sanctuary in our hand still, just because we don't have any threat of missing out on the effect, just because we have no insects in order to go ahead and facilitate that. So with this, you have a fairly safe turn 1 with a very defensive monster. And then then you have a way to deal with their back row if they decide to overextend. And then on the crackback, you would be able to go ahead and play Resonant Insect or Chainsaw Insect, depending on what you want to do. I think personally what I would do is I would play the Resonance Insect alongside the Verdant Sanctuary. That way, you not only are you able to search out with the effect of Resonance, but you're also able to use the effect of Verdant Sanctuary to search once again. Another cool thing is that if they decided to attack this monster while face up on the field, it would also protect the Resonant Insect if that was the concern for you. But let's say they destroyed the Resonance Insect, you could then go ahead and search out quite a bit. In this scenario, I would probably search out the Parasite to our hand. And additionally, I would go ahead and search out probably Parasite Paranoid, so that we can later on establish a bigger insect monster during the duel. And also it's a defensive card, so that's pretty great. Those are just some rough ideas of how to exactly play out this deck. Let's go ahead and do one more hand, and this time we'll do it with the broken skill. Alright then, so let's go ahead and try this hand out, this time with my Precious Queen. And it's actually kind of fitting that we ended up getting Insect Queen here. So put this at the top of the deck. And turn one, what I would personally do is that I could potentially just chill here and do nothing, just because at the end of the turn, I'm getting a token regardless. But if you really wanted to have a monster on field, you could go ahead and also summon out the Chainsaw Insect and end your turn on that. And that's not half bad whatsoever, just because on your opponent's turn, they are going to have a very hard time outing the Chainsaw Insect, and if they attack into the token, by the end of the time that they end our turn, we're going to get another token on the field, which can be used to tribute summon the Insect Queen on the crackback. And yeah, so you would draw into Dust Tornado, you could then tribute off the token for your Insect Queen. And in this scenario, you would have a Chainsaw Insect and Insect Queen that are going to be able to do a lot of damage. Another cool thing is that at the end of the turn, even if you decide not to attack with Insect Queen because you are going to require to tribute the Insect Monster, you would also get another token at the end of the turn, and that's going to be fueling up the Insect Queen a lot more. But yeah, this skill is very broken and it's extremely unfun to play against. Alright guys, and with that, this concludes today's video. If you guys did end up enjoying today's video and would like to support the channel, then I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Also, as I mentioned earlier in this video, I did make a complete guide to Battle City Finals, so if you'd like to check that out, then there'll be a link in the description below. And yeah, with that being said, thank you so much for the support, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.